Good morning. I think certainly in the annals of U.S. engagement with Africa, we must add a new paradigm, and that is the Camden Conference paradigm. The Camden Conference citizen diplomacy paradigm, in which, for one of the first times, and I've been around the block, you have authoritative African voices interpreting Africa to the United States. And I'd like to really raise my hand to my colleagues who've spoken at this conference, Ofebia, Ka, Vemba, Ali, and so many others, for a wonderful, wonderful contribution. And so my duty this morning, humbled as I am by their outstanding performance, is simply to wrap up what they have said. I have been around, I speak publicly around the world, and very often it is said to me that I am very good as a public speaker. But, after attending the conference here at Camden, I must say that I'm one of several good public speakers, assuming it is true. But anyway, more seriously, I'd like to really just thank the Camden Conference organizers. I will not go into details. It's been a great conference. I thank them very much. I thank my host, Jane Hartman. And I'd just like to say, as we say in Nigeria, when we don't want to repeat what everybody else has said in terms of preambles, all protocols observed. This morning, I'm going to be talking about foreign investment and economic diplomacy in Africa. And, but I will start with a more general discussion that is very important for an accurate understanding of foreign investment in Africa. And that discussion begins with the concept of globalization. That's the concept, that's the context in which economic activity in the world today takes place. And if you don't understand globalization, if you don't engage with globalization, and if you don't take advantage of the opportunities of globalization, you are not going to be able to achieve prosperity. Now, Ofebia told you about my book. Permit me to tell you about the book one more time. The reason I will tell you about my book is because it is really very important that you read the book. And it's not because I wrote it. That's just a coincidence. But as I was saying, Africa is very rarely interpreted to the world authoritatively by Africans. Very rare. It's always somebody else writing about the continent, speaking about the continent, and so you don't get the African, the real, true African perspective that I think we have seen at this conference. And so Emerging Africa was my humble attempt at a contribution to this discussion about the new Africa, which is what we're discussing at this year's Camden Conference. So I just thought I'd mention it one more time. But the book discusses globalization, it discusses foreign aid, discusses capitalism as a context in which Africa is trying to seek its prosperity, discusses finance, foreign investment, innovation and technology, and Africa's relationship with the international economic order, international institutions like the IMF and the World Bank and so on, and discusses a number of other subjects as well. But globalization is the context. And what's globalization? That's the process of increasing interconnectedness of what we know from history to be previously well-demarcated nation states. That's globalization. It is driven largely by technology. And so today we sit in our homes, in our televisions, everybody in Africa, every woman and her aunt, every man and his uncle has a mobile phone. Africa has the greatest mobile phone penetration on Earth. There are about 600 million cell phones in the continent, in a continent of about 1 billion people, 600 to 700 million cell phones. And 140 million of those cell phones are in Nigeria. Now, the cell phone has brought about a lot of interconnectivity. And because of this, a lot of people in Africa and a lot of people around the world who are observing Africa have assumed that Africa has arrived. Because Africa is now more connected with the world. More people are on Facebook in Africa, more people are on Instagram, and all these things, and the cell phones. But a lot of people have not asked themselves the question, who is manufacturing the cell phone? For me, that's the question that matters. Who's selling you the cell phone? And so the point is that globalization has made Africa a market. And because of that, a lot of people think that Africa is rising. I'll come to the point about Africa rising specifically. So globalization is an important context in which we must look at Africa. And as I was saying, technology is the chief driver. Now, but we need to know that globalization has drivers, it has passengers. Who are the drivers? The drivers are here in Camden, Maine. They are in Tokyo. They are in Beijing, in Shanghai. The passengers, a lot of them are in Abuja. A lot of them are in Lagos. Some are in Kinshasa, and so on. Globalization is not benign in its intent. It's not agnostic in its belief. That is to say, it is not an altruistic concept at all. Globalization has an agenda, and there are people who are driving it. I'm not saying whether it's good or bad. I'm just saying that we need to understand it for what it truly is. So, and what is it that is behind globalization? It is what I call global strategic intent. The intent to dominate the world, whether it's especially economically. So, because that's what creates the wealth of nations. It's that strategic intent to dominate. And so when we're discussing the new Africa, if we're not discussing Africa from this perspective of whether or not Africa has global strategic intent to become, if not a dominant player, at least a self-sustaining one. If you're not discussing Africa in that context, then you're dumbing down Africa. That's the point. Is Africa rising? I say not really. Not really, because Africa is not engaging the world on its own terms. Africa is engaging the world on everybody else's terms except its own. And I'll talk a little bit about this when I come to foreign investment specifically, because foreign investment is a very important aspect of globalization. Globalization has two economic dimensions that are overarching. The first is world trade, and the second is foreign investment. So that's why there's a very strong link between globalization and foreign investment. Africa has embraced globalization uncritically. We assume it's a wonderful thing because we have our cell phones and we have our apps, and so everybody is with it. And so we're just going with the flow. Nobody's really, thinking, nobody's interrogating globalization. But I say, and of course, even though we are embracing globalization uncritically, Of course, we know that some important evolutionary changes have taken place in the continent. And we've discussed this all of this conference, including, of course, the problematic application of democracy in the continent. Everybody in Africa is now a Democrat. But when you actually put your eye into the water, as we say in Nigeria, and look at the matter, you will wonder whether it's all democracy or whether it's just a them so crazy. Now, I agree, and I believe that for you to rise, for a continent to rise, that continent or that country must have its economies based on competitive production. That's the point, and that's the standard that we must pursue for Africa. Don't have a different and lower standard for Africa than you have for Asia, than you have for America, than you have for Europe. That's the point. So Africa's economies today, they're primarily consumerist, and they're primarily commodity driven. Africa is developing a very strong mall culture, new malls opening up everywhere in the continent. You come to Kenya, you come to Nigeria, you go to everywhere, malls, malls, malls. Everyone in Africa is a shopper. So Africa is becoming the world's market, but is it the world's factory? The world's factory is in China, and Africa is becoming the world's markets. And that's one of the reasons the continent today is facing a major downturn, because the factory is having some problems in China. And therefore, of course, the market will feel the heat. So, can Africa rise? Of course, it can. But Africa can only rise on one condition, and that's my most important fundamental contribution to this conference. And that is that Africa can only rise if its countries develop strong and coherent worldviews. Everybody must have a worldview. I never leave home without mine. It's like my American Express card. And when you deal with me, just 15, 20 minutes, you will see my worldview. And I have no apologies to offer. That's the way that people can rise and be relevant in the world. You've got to have a worldview. Don't leave home without it. This, I believe, is the most fundamental aspect of Africa's development dilemma. The absence of a coherent, African-led, African-natured worldview. And some references have been made in discussions earlier here about, Carr talked about the need to go back into African history and so on and so forth. So this is very important. And what is a worldview? We all have it, but we actually don't think about it. We don't sort of go around thinking, well, this is my worldview. No, but we all have worldviews. We all have a way, each one of us, that we see the world. We have a fundamental set of assumptions that we make about life and about the world. And those assumptions help us to interpret the world, and they guide us as we move in the world. That's what a worldview is. It's a set of assumptions we have about the makeup of the world and how these assumptions create certain realities in the world. Now, it comes from the German philosophical concept of Weltanschauung. You might forgive my German. But that's a concept. Welt is world, and Anschauung means view. All great powers and civilizations, ancient or modern, are built on worldviews. Africa cannot be different. And so Africa cannot become great again. It was once great. And that's a different matter. That's history. But it's important that we remember that Africa was once a great civilization. But today, it's not what it was. Why? Because others with worldviews overtook Africa. Worldviews are very subjective. It doesn't matter. But if it is consistent enough, if it's coherent enough, if it's applied scientifically enough, it will create objective realities, one of which was slavery. The transatlantic slave trade was built on a worldview of racial superiority, and that worldview was applied to be able to sustain the economic emergence of the Western world, especially, the United States and some parts of Europe. Colonialism was an extension of that worldview. When slavery became unpopular, when slavery could no longer be sustained, the extraction moved to the point of extraction. You don't have to bring them here. You go there and take it and send it back. This is what worldviews do. And if you look at the West today, and you look at the East, which is China, you will see how the rise of each has been driven by a worldview. In China, their worldview is as follows, and it's based on some aspects of Confucianism, the main religion. Chinese have a very eternal view of time and space. Chinese believe in stability as an end in itself, and therefore, the community is much more important than the individual. This is the Chinese and broadly Asian worldview. The West has a very different worldview. It's a worldview that is based on individual liberties. It's a worldview that is, and those individual liberties gave rise to institutions and the protection of human rights. And it's a worldview that is built on scientific rationalism. That gave rise to innovation. So you see how the West became rich, how the Chinese became rich. And you see the connection with this philosophical foundation. It's very important. And that is why I think that Africa must have it, and that our societies must be able to be organized and to be inspired by worldviews. All that brings me to what we're talking about now, and that is Africa as the last frontier, foreign investment in Africa. The world now sees Africa as, quote unquote, the last frontier. But whose last frontier is it? It's certainly not mine. It's my first frontier. That's my first frontier. And so, if you don't have a world view, you would not even think about the meaning of that phrase, the last frontier. But that's one of the reasons I wrote the book, to discuss this so-called last frontier from the perspective of the inhabitants and the natives of the last frontier, and what is in the interest of the people who make up this last frontier. Now, foreign investment in Africa, everybody says foreign investment is going to Africa, foreign investment is going to Africa. That's true. There's a lot more interest in Africa. Africa is emerging in the global economy, without doubt. But let's also look at the reality and compare it with what happens elsewhere. Africa still accounts for just 4% of global foreign investment. In other words, there is a lot more noise about foreign investment in Africa than actual foreign investment in Africa. It's very important to know this, that the enthusiasm for investing in Africa is more than the actual quantum of investments that have gone into Africa. So very important. Now, it's also very important to understand that most Africa-bound investment is in extractive industries, not necessarily in the places where it would have transformational impact. For example, in education, as Jennifer said. So when we're talking about foreign investment, you have a lot of African countries today, a lot of African presidents. They're running around the whole world saying, we're looking for foreign investment. And I just laugh. I just laugh. Because this is not the way to go about it. What type of foreign investment are you bringing? Somebody's bringing a mall so you can spend your money. And you say you found foreign investment, and that's why you've been perambulating around the world rather than sitting at home and governing your people properly. Another very important thing for us to understand is that Africans themselves, and this is one of the new evolutionary changes, Africans themselves are now major investments in Africa. So we have a lot of African companies like Dangote Group. Dangote is a Nigerian who's the wealthiest man in Africa. And so he's invested in so many African countries now, manufacturing cement. He's not trading, he's manufacturing. So he's creating factories that employ people. Africans, and they're manufacturing things that are exported to the rest of the world. That's a good model. You've got MTN, the telecommunications, the South African telecommunications group. So these are major investors in African countries. By the way, a number of American companies are increasingly beginning to come into Africa. Walmart is coming into Nigeria. If you don't know Walmart, you don't know anything else. I shop there. I'm very proud to say that. And I buy things there cheaper than I would buy them elsewhere. And they look just as nice. So Walmart is coming into Nigeria. Kellogg's, you know, the food company, they're also coming into Africa in partnership with a Singaporean firm, Olam, and so on. And so many other American companies are now increasingly coming into the continent. Now, what is the attraction to Africa for foreign investment? The first attraction, of course, is that it's the inevitable consequence of globalization. A British political philosopher in 1936, Frank McEachran, I think was his name, he wrote and said, "There are now no new markets," he said. "Short of opening up the moon, a limit has come to expansion." And it was seen as a very wise philosophical saying. 1936, he should be around today to see what's happening. And not only are we not talking about investment in Africa, we're now talking about space colonies. So the imagination of man is really very powerful, and you should not put limits on it. The second reason is that geopolitics, geoeconomics, and geostrategy is a major driver of foreign investment in Africa, specifically the rise of China. The rise of China is driving a lot of interest in Africa because the West can now see how China has outflanked it in terms of geostrategy and geoeconomics. They were afraid of going into Africa to invest and do business. The Chinese have come in and undertaken pretty much a second colonization of the continent. And what's all that based on? Raw materials. Natural resources. Africa has had foreign investment for a long time, 500 years to say the least. It just depends on what you're talking about. But when you look at it very carefully, it's all about the political economy of extraction. So geostrategy, China is dominant in the continent, America is playing catch-up, Europe is now playing catch-up. So that's another a very important reason. Some people invest in Africa because it has a low correlation to the rest of the integrated world economy. So it can be a hedging device for a hedge fund manager. If you're a wealth manager, and I'm sure there are some of them here, some of which have sponsored this conference, and you want to hedge, you might want to look at Africa because its cycles are different from the cycles of the rest of the world. So some people invest in Africa for that reason. Very important is that there are great returns on your investment. If you are an investor, you want to make money. You're not an NGO. You are in business for profit. And the greatest profits for those who are not faint of heart are actually to be found in Africa. The typical returns on investment in Africa are about 30%. And that's very high compared to everywhere else in the world. The global financial crisis was a very important reason. Western markets became saturated, and so there was a new move to other markets, new frontiers, last frontiers. Natural resources, huge importance. Large and growing populations equal markets. Africa is 1 billion, it's growing. It's the most, population-wise speaking, the fastest growing continent in the world is Africa. And so that's business for a lot of people who are thinking ahead about their products and where to market it. And then, of course, we have increasing political stability, although, of course, we have had some problems. But broadly speaking, the continent is now much more at peace than it once was. So just a chart to illustrate where things are. This is foreign direct investment inflows by region between 2012 and 2014. So here we see developing Asia, which has had the highest inflows of foreign investment. There we see Europe, we see Latin America and the Caribbean, we see North America, then the transition economies, and then Africa here. So even though there is a lot more investment than there used to be, it's still very small compared to the rest of the world. And I think this is very important for us to note. Let's see how attractive Africa is to investors. We see that in 2011, about 7 other regions were more attractive than Africa. In 2012, Africa's attraction increased. In 2013, it stayed the same. In 2014, it shot up dramatically to become the second most favored investment destination in the world. And then in 2015, it dropped slightly. But what this shows is a certain trajectory of increased investment. Right now, of course, the continent is having some problems because of the global downturn and China's slowdown. These are the top 15 African countries by FDI investments. You will see countries like Nigeria, South Africa, Ghana, Morocco, Egypt, Ethiopia, Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, Zambia, Mozambique. Most foreign investment in Africa goes to these countries. So I thought it was important to show that, to give a certain flavor of what's happening in the continent. And these are, the sources of FDI. Most of Africa's foreign investment now is coming not just Western Europe and basically Asia. Those are the 2 main sources of foreign investment. And Africa itself, of course, as I said. So Western Europe, Africa, and then Asia Pacific. North America is 4th in terms of sources of foreign investment in the continent. And these are the top industries. Really, the biggest industry receiving foreign investment is in the technology, media, and telecommunications space. So that's what you'll see there. So that's just to give you a general flavor. Now, when you want to think about investing in Africa, there are a number of obstacles that have held back investments, one of which is the ease of doing business. A lot of people perceive that it's not easy to do business in Africa. And that's true, but many African countries are trying to improve their ease of doing business. And then people think about the risks. There is a perception that Africa is a very risky place. Now, how true this is a different matter, because risk has no address, as we have seen, 1, from the global financial crisis, 2, from the Arab Spring. Because a lot of people used to think, if you want to invest in Africa, go to North Africa, leave sub-Saharan Africa alone. It's very risky. But we've seen events totally upend these perceptions. There's a huge infrastructure deficit. Jennifer talked about this. Transport alone adds 15% to the cost of doing business. Electricity costs add 20 to 30% to the costs of doing business in Africa. And that is why the Power Africa initiative of the Obama administration is very important. But I want to add a caveat. If Africa is waiting and thinking that it's Americans that are going to come and light up the whole continent for them, I'm sorry. They will find out that it will not happen. Because there is no one who has an incentive to light up that continent more than the Africans themselves. So they must be the one driving the whole process. So, but there's a Power Africa Act that has just been signed as law and so on. So then you have issues of policy inconsistency, problems with the rule of law, and security. In Boko Haram and all that. In Nigeria, all the investment that is coming into Nigeria is coming into the southern part of Nigeria. The northern part, where Boko Haram is active, does not, for the past decade, has not received any significant foreign investment. And that's really very sad. But that's the security consideration. Then the final question, and I'll just touch on it very briefly, is the question of whether or not foreign investment actually drives economic growth and development. Because that's the question you have to ask yourself. All these African leaders running around. Obama had this leaders conference that Jennifer talked about. And I'm like, why is Africa the only continent in the world that leaders have Africa conferences for? And every president in Africa will come to Washington. They will come to India. They'll go to China. They'll go to Turkey. They'll go to Japan. Oh dear. What does this show? The absence of a worldview. That's what it shows. You are engaging with the world. You are having encounters with the world with no global strategic intent. You are a passenger. You are invited to join the bus for a photo op, and you very gladly do so. And you come back to your country and say, oh, I was just in Washington with Obama. Do you know that in Nigeria, there is a governor, I shall not mention his name. He came to Washington, shook hands with Obama, and there's a massive billboard in the Capitol. And this is what he's telling his people is one of his achievements. He shook hands with Obama. Oh dear. This is what happens when you have a problem with mental infrastructure. Don't get me wrong, there's a lot that's going right. But we need to examine fundamentally the basis on which we claim that Africa is rising. Nobody has a greater interest in that self-examination than us. Socrates said, the unexamined life is not worth living. So I think it's for us as Africans to begin to redefine this debate and to engage with our partners as we redefine the debate and to say, these are the things that we want. And how is our partnership with you going to help us to achieve these things? There are a number of other things, but I shall not go into them because time is upon us. But I just think, and we will discuss them during the panel, but I just want to round off by saying, let's just take a whole new look at this new Africa thing. And in that context, congratulate once again the Camden Conference. Because there are very few conferences that will give us the opportunity to discuss it as we have discussed it here. And so you should take credit for whenever we come to the real new Africa, which we are hoping to build. But that new Africa must be based on the fundamental understandings that you cannot leave home without. That you've got to have a view of the world, you've got to have an agenda, you've got to have a plan. Life is just not a series of accidents. And that a photo op with Obama is nice in your living room, it's nice for your children, but don't go back to your country and say that this is your achievement. It just makes you look foolish. I just can't believe this. I mean, I drove through this capital and saw this huge thing. And the guy goes around prattling all over the place. I was in Washington, I met with Obama. I'm like, oh dear. That's what we don't need. And the worst thing about it is that this guy, I shall not mention his name, is having dreams of becoming the president of Nigeria. Heaven forfend. Thank you. Yeah.